It's the king of drifting, and yet is often forgotten in the mainstream culture. It's the Nissan Silvia. The first car to wear the Silvia badge was a bit different than all the others because it did not use the famous S-body chassis. We'll get to that in a little bit. This one used the CSP311 chassis, and it was debuted at the 1964 Tokyo Motor Show. Now, Silvia is a variant of the word Sylvie, I think it's pronounced the same, I don't know, which is a genus term to assign classes to birds, which some think is an allusion to the Bluebird and S-body platform to come. But in the meantime, CSP311 was also called the Datsun Coupe 1500, a lot easier to say that one, with a handcrafted body borrowing some styling cues from the Lancia Fulvia. Of course, I gotta say, if you're gonna borrow styling cues, you can't go wrong with borrowing from Lancia. The 1.6-liter Nissan R engine made a respectable 96 horsepower in 1965. Oh, and only 554 were made, and only 59 were sold outside of Japan, so they are very, very rare. We would have to fast forward, though, another decade to the next Silvia, the S10. This was the first Silvia to use the famous S-body chassis. Instead of borrowing styling cues from a Lancia, it borrows styling cues from the Skyline, its older brother. And sure, it may have only had a little 1.4-liter inline-4, but the thing weighed just 2,200 pounds. And it had the same driveline as a Datsun 510. And the Datsun 510 was pretty darn good. Although the independent rear suspension was replaced with leaf springs, but it's still a pretty good budget sports car. Not bad, Nissan, not bad for the first time in a decade. The S110 came out at the end of 1979, and this is when the names started getting really confusing. There was the Gazelle, the Sakura, the 1800SX, and the 200SX, and the Silvia, depending on your location and or your company. So for simplicity's sake, I'm gonna call it the Silvia. And there was a new body style as well as the new names. A hatchback design. Now this was going to use a rotary engine of all things, but Nissan's rotary never really went anywhere, so the Z-Series engines were used instead, and the turbo model of those made 133 horsepower, and could do 0 to 60 in 9 seconds, which is solid for 1979. Although, a 285 horsepower 240 RS model, yeah, they changed the name again, don't worry, was entered in WRC Group B. However, it had less than 300 horsepower, and was rear-wheel drive, and was going up against 500 horsepower all-wheel drive cars. So, the best it ever did was second place at Rally New Zealand. But it did have more success in FIA Group 5 Super Silhouette Racing. These things were stupid. They had as much power as Formula 1 cars, and they had comical bodywork, because you had to keep the roof, the hood, and the doors the same as the road car. Everything else can be modified, including the track width. Wired track with better handling, bigger tires. So they stuck massive body kits on it. And the reason the wing looked so out of place is because the wing could not exceed the width of the normal car. So it had to stay at a really tiny width. But the rest of the car had these massive flares. So we have this tiny little wing that covers about a third of the car. Yeah, I know, the thing's mental. The S12, released in 1983, was a little more back to basics. Had a few new things, like new notchback body styles, coupe body styles, everything in between pretty much. And it was initially fitted with the FJ20ET engine, 203 horsepower, thanks to a twin-scroll exhaust manifold. Pretty good for the 80s. And we actually got this car. We got the Silvia, although it only made 165 horsepower. So, yeah, at least we got it. The S13 came out in 1988, a few years later, and this is when things really started to pick up. It was one of the first cars to use Nissan's multi-link independent rear suspension and available four-wheel steering. It also had a maximum curb weight of 2,700 pounds. So combine the four-wheel steering, the multi-link suspension, and the incredibly lightweight, the thing was a proper handling car. It was a good sports car. And initially it had the S12 CA18 DET engine, which was good. But in 1990, they switched to the legendary SR20, making 205 horsepower. More specifically, the SR20 DET. Now, what the heck does that all mean? SR, engine code number, 22 liters, dual overhead cams for the D, electronic fuel injection for the E, and turbo for the T. Now, I'm gonna get off on a tangent because I really want to talk about this car. But this was not the most powerful SR20. It was also not the only car to use the SR20, no. Those honors belong to an oddball. The Nissan Pulsar. Nissan built a Group A homologation version of the Pulsar called the GTI-R in 1994. And it had the most powerful SR20 ever made at the time, with 227 horsepower, 210 torque. Had a functional hood scoop that was a bit comical, yes. Also featured a functional rear wing and even optional rally fogs. Come on! Oh, and it had all-wheel drive, which let it do 0 to 60 in 5.4 seconds. It was faster than most sports cars of the day. The little Nissan Pulsar hatchback. Oh, and it had a top speed of 144 miles an hour, which sounds terrifying in a Pulsar. If you've seen a Pulsar, it's not very big. However, it never actually won the World Rally Championship. But it did win the Group N category. It just didn't win the top tier that it was entered in, primarily. So Nissan ditched the Pulsar very early on, and moved to the R390 Le Mans car. That's quite a step up. And anyway, I'm getting off topic. Back to the Silvia. The S14 debuted in 1993, and it was a little lower, a little wider, which means it was a bit better handling. Now, that did mean it got an extra 100 pounds added to the weight, but it was still less than 3,000 pounds. And the SR20 was updated with a bigger turbo and variable cam timing, so it had a bit more power too. Later versions of the S14 got reinforced engine block, reinforced pistons, and reinforced gearboxes. But we don't want to talk about later versions, we want to talk about the top tier of the S14. The Nismo 270R. Serving as a 10th anniversary present to Nismo, Nissan gave Nismo whatever they wanted to tinker around with the Silvia S14. So they strengthened the clutch, they gave it a limited slip differential, a vented hood, a front-mounted intercooler, revised suspension, and a Nismo aero kit. Combine all of that, it had a 270 horsepower SR20. This thing was a little rocket ship, and it could actually handle too. It wasn't just a slidey track toy, it could actually go around corners really fast. This continued on with the S15 at the turn of the century. The SR20 was bumped up to its most powerful on a normal road car at 250 horsepower in the S15 thanks to a new engine management system. The weight was also brought down because of smaller dimensions, just so it could be sold as a compact sports car in Japan. And while we didn't get this car, most of the world except Australia, New Zealand, and Japan didn't get this car, Japan saved the best for themselves. It was called the Spec R. Featured a lot of handling improvements like brake booster, helical limited slip differential, chassis stiffening, larger anti-roll bars, and 4-wheel steering. It also equipped with a 6-speed manual gearbox rather than a simple 4-speed, and it was sold as a bit more track focused, and the thing looks good. Unfortunately, these performance versions could not save Unfortunately, these performance versions could not save the Silvia, and along with the S-body, it was discontinued in 2002. And with the Nissan 400Z being teased, well, as I'm filming this, I don't think the Silvia name is coming back anytime soon. But that doesn't mean it's not around anymore. No, it's still kicking, because the S13 and the S15 are universally known as the best drift cars just about anywhere. And it's easy to see why. The SR20 can take a ton of power before giving up. The chassis is very light, and it can be easily sturdy to handle the intensity of drifting. It's very light, it's very compact, it's very well balanced, has good suspension from the factory, and if that SR20 isn't good enough for you, you can always go to an engine swap. The engine bay is plentiful in size. You should easily be able to swap pretty much anything you want in there. In fact, the Silvia is so good at drifting, there are still S14s and S15s competing in the Formula Drift Championship today, 20 years after their discontinuation. But maybe you don't want to drift. That's fine. Perfectly fine. Well, they're also very quick on the track. A team called Under Suzuki is competing in the World Time Attack Championship with a Silvia, mustering 800 horsepower and a comical body kit. They currently hold the I can't pronounce it, I'm sorry. Suzuka lap record at 50.366 seconds, which is faster than a Super GT Honda NSX. So, it doesn't matter if you're going sideways around a corner or 150 miles an hour through one. The Silvia can work for you.